So this is a test. Hi, my name is Sam, and I'm watching some movies. So as a personal project, I decided to watch every Best Picture winner and nominee. All of them. Initially, this was going to be a personal endeavor for my own cultural enrichment. But after watching the first set of movies and then posting about it on the social media, I got a better than expected response, and I thought I might try to flesh it out a bit more and put it in a larger video format. So here we are, with the first edition of whatever this is. So let's start with the ceremony. The first Oscars were pretty weird, as things normally are when you're just starting out. They occurred on May 16th, 1929, covering kind of 1927 and 1928. The tickets cost $5. The winners were announced 3 months beforehand. The whole ceremony took 15 minutes, and presumably everybody went home and no one complained about the commercials. This is the only ceremony that was not broadcast live. It's the only ceremony where actors and actresses were nominated based on their entire output instead of individual roles. And also, for our purposes, the weird wrinkle here is it's the only year in which there were two different categories for quote-unquote Best Picture. There was Outstanding Picture, and there was Best Artistic and Unique Picture. At the time, both awards were considered equally prestigious, and they were meant to award two different kinds of movies, the arty-farty type and the populist, big blockbuster-esque movies. So for my purposes, I watched everything from both categories, but we'll start with what is considered now the canonical Best Picture, Wings. So, Wings, the most outstanding picture of the first Academy Awards, is not necessarily the one that critics would go back to and say is the best movie of this year, but it's no slouch. It's, I think, a worthy winner in its own right, and that is mostly due to, I think, the production, which is legitimately insane, and it is still impressive to this day. In particular, I think the most effective production stuff has to do with the airplane combat, dogfights. You have actors in close-up flying the planes in the air, all while the filming is happening. It's the kind of thing that Tom Cruise gets lauded for today, but hey, as it turns out, they were doing it back then as well. And I mean, it's not just that. You have infantrymen and extras, a huge cadre of them, making for some really spectacular war and battle scenes. It is really just impressive. It's well directed. It has this famous tracking shot, which is still a treat to this day, I think. And everything about the production is really great, and I think is a big part of why this movie can still be really enjoyable to watch today. I will say the story, pretty boring, pretty blah, schmaltzy, war romance stuff, an awkward love triangle that doesn't really work. The original 1920s It Girl, Clara Bow, feels pretty wasted. She's sort of the most magnetic actor in this movie, and she's not a big part of it. It doesn't detract, I would say, from the movie overall. It's still perfectly enjoyable to watch. It's just not really exceptional. What you're really here for is some crazy production, some still fairly exciting dogfights, and the historical marker of being the most outstanding picture of the first Academy Awards. Other historical notes: it's one of the first big movies to show nudity. There's this male butt shot that shows up. It has a same-sex couple in that tracking shot, if you were paying attention. And it also has one of the movie's first same-sex kisses, though it's not a kiss I would consider sexual in nature. It's a kiss nonetheless. So yeah, I like this movie. I think it was an enjoyable watch. It didn't burn me out. The schmaltzy stuff wasn't too bad, and a lot of the stuff was genuinely entertaining. Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, is the best artistic and unique picture of the first Academy Awards. Sunrise is considered a masterpiece, one of the best movies of the silent era, one of the greatest movies of all time. You'll often see it in the top 10 all-time great movie lists. And it is certainly what would probably be considered the actual best movie of this year. And if you were going to watch any of these movies, this is probably the one I would recommend, if only for its pedigree and its historical significance. It's a big marker in the art form. Sunrise is the story of a man who is tempted to kill his wife by a girl from the city. The movie never names its characters beyond this, and it's meant to convey a universal quality. The wife is that which is good, the girl from the city is temptation, one wears white, one wears black. We're working with a bit of allegory. And I'll be honest, I sort of found the story fine. I was interested initially by the darkness of the premise of a man tempted to kill his wife, and I kept myself pretty ignorant of where the movie goes. So when it leaned into a more sentimental route, I will admit there was a bit of disappointment on that front, and that probably did a bit too much to paint how I felt about the rest of the movie, which is enjoyable nonetheless. That said, I mean, the whole movie is a treat to watch. Everything is wonderfully, artfully framed, and it does achieve the song quality that it goes for. It almost feels like a painting in that sense, not necessarily in how it looks visually, but in how considered everything feels and how tastefully arranged everything is, if that makes sense. The cinematography is beautiful and evocative, and it really has some incredible effects that lend it a special quality and only reinforce that song quality, that art quality that it goes for. And there are some shots that I still am not sure how they did on physical film in 1927. And the fact that I want to know how they did that, I think is an indicator of a really good film. Unfortunately, my bad take here is that this movie just didn't grip me the way that I honestly wanted it to. And I feel like I need to rewatch it to appreciate it properly. Silent films in particular are much more susceptible to getting ruined by distractions, and I think that's on me. This is a movie that you have to really fall into, and I think it just caught me at a bad time. I expect to rewatch it at some point in my life, and I'm really looking forward to it. 3.5 out of 5. Also, I think they might have actually gotten this pig drunk for this scene. Seventh Heaven was the most nominated movie of the night. It had 5 nominations, won 3 awards, and was a nominee for Outstanding Picture. Seventh Heaven is a movie about a poor Parisian streetwasher who reluctantly saves a young woman from her abusive sister by lying to a cop about being her husband. When the cop says he'll be around later to check up and make sure he's not lying, the two have to shack up to keep up the lie, and hey, what do you know, they fall in love. Before I get into all that, though, I do have to say, this is where we start to get into the fact that a lot of these older, more obscure movies are a bit of a crapshoot quality-wise. In this case, the transfer that I saw wasn't great, so a lot of the visual fidelity was lost, and these are movies that really live or die based on how they look. I mean, they're silent movies. You're not coming to them for the soundtrack. So with this one in particular, even some of the shots that I thought might look really good, I kind of just couldn't tell. And that's one of the drawbacks of things getting lost to time. As for the movie, it just kind of didn't work for me anyway. It's kind of a standard rom-com setup. These two reluctantly get together, and then she's in love with him, he doesn't like her, and then he likes her. It's not the kind of gripping drama that you might hope for out of a Best Picture nominee. There's a bunch of religious stuff with the guy Chico not believing in God, and then ultimately sort of getting turned over to Christianity. It just honestly doesn't work for me at all. The romance just kind of didn't work for me either. It just wasn't charming enough for me to care. The most effective stuff in this movie for me was Diane, the waif that's rescued, learning to come out of her shell and overcoming her own fears. But just as she sort of gets to that point, Suddenly war breaks out and Chico has to go off to war, and it becomes a war romance movie. And it gets really sentimental, and it just doesn't do a lot for me in that regard. And really, I just didn't connect with it in the way that I had hoped I might. The movie was just a bit too sentimental, a bit too sudsy for me. 2 out of 5. The Crowd, one of the nominees for Best Artistic and Unique Picture, was a struggle to watch. And that's not because it's a bad movie. It's because it's never been released on Blu-ray, and it's never been released on DVD, and it isn't streamable anywhere. The most common viewing method that I could find for this movie was to catch it on TCM at some odd hour of the morning, and it's a total shame. The Crowd is my personal favorite of this bunch of movies, and a big part of its appeal for me was that it just feels much more modern than a lot of these other movies. The Crowd is the story of a man, John Sims, ostensibly trying to live the American dream in 1920s New York. He gets a corporate job, meets a girl, gets married, yada yada yada. It all feels very real. And it's helped a lot by the chemistry of the 2 leads, played by James Murray and Eleanor Boardman. In their initial meeting, these 2 people feel like they genuinely like each other. Like, they're not just getting shoved together for the sake of the plot, but these are 2 people that you could see actually getting along, dating, and maybe getting married. And it really makes you want these 2 people to succeed, because they are charming together. They have a lot of chemistry, they bounce off each other, they have fun with each other. And the relationship, when it gets rocky for depressingly relatable reasons like, I'm sick of living in this tiny apartment that keeps falling apart with this other person, or I'm sick of not getting ahead in my job despite working pretty hard. When the relationship gets rocky for those reasons, you still hope that they succeed, and you still think that they might, because there's a foundation of love and enjoyment of each other that is honestly absent in a lot of these overly sentimental romances, especially of this era. It's a really beautiful film. And for all that I complained about the bad quality of the Seventh Heaven transfer impeding my experience of that movie, I think The Crowd is compositionally really strong. And so even though I also watched a really bad quality transfer for this, it's still really shown through. And there's still a lot of things that struck me and stood out, and moments where I was like, oh wow, that looks really nice. It genuinely surprises me that this movie has not had any modern restoration effort. It feels like exactly the kind of movie to sit in the middle of a Criterion collection. The version I watched was, I think, a transfer from 1981. And I mean, maybe the TCM version that people are seeing on TV is higher quality and they just don't think the market is there to release a home copy. I don't know. But it's a shame, because this is the movie that really moved me. And it moved me in spite of being a bit of a pixelated mess. It's the one that surprised me, and I hope that it gets some kind of real artistic reevaluation, so that it doesn't just get watched by weirdos going through Academy Award history. It also gets watched by weirdos going through just general film history. 4 out of 5, I hope I get to rewatch a better version one day. The Racket is the last of the Outstanding Picture nominees that I watched, and I will admit to feeling some fatigue by this point. It wasn't helped by me feeling like I had run out of the good movies and was finishing up and checking the last boxes of a to-do list. So I was a bit trepidatious at this point, but I was pleasantly surprised that The Racket was a new, more exciting genre, the crime drama. This movie was banned in Chicago at the time because it showed a corrupt police force and a corrupt local government, which makes sense because Chicago has never had any corruption or organized crime and definitely doesn't need people getting that impression. So the movie itself is a classic setup for a crime drama. You have a legitimate cop struggling against the corrupt forces above him and organized crime against him. It's kind of another movie that exists in the it's fine category. Certainly it helps that there are shootouts and car chases and, drama in that sense. But I honestly struggled to keep invested when the crime stopped and the drama started. There is a plot line about electioneering, and there's a lot of talking for a silent movie. And by this point, I was just sort of out of it. I will say It wasn't the worst watch. It wasn't the best watch. It sort of seemed like your standard, what I would call Tuesday cable fare. I don't know that I'll particularly remember it, but I will remember this shot of two mobsters staring each other down at a funeral with their guns in their hats. I think that's great. .5 out of 5. Chang, A Drama of the Wilderness, is a documentary that was the final nomination for Best Artistic and Unique Production. Chang is a simple story that of a poor farmer in Thailand struggling for survival in the wilderness of the jungle, and it wouldn't really stand up to any modern ethical standards at all, but it is notable for being the closest a quote-unquote documentary has gotten to a Best Picture nomination. As for the movie itself, it was cool to see a unique setting for the era. It's easy to see why this was a huge hit at the time, given that it was probably audiences' only real means to see a jungle. And it's interesting to go back and see how it was presented to audiences that might have been fully ignorant of what that environment was, what it looked like, and its flora and fauna. The movie does have a weird problem where the narrative feels too forced upon it to stand up as a proper documentary, and it's a little too documentary to have a real plot to invest in. Like, the appeal of watching this movie is seeing exotic people and exotic locations, and that really doesn't hit the same way after 95 years. I will fully cop to being a little burnt out when I saw this. It took a good amount of hunting to find a way to watch it, and so by the time I figured out how to rent it, I was more exasperated than was ideal, and it didn't have any innate appeal to me outside of this project. So I may be being a bit harsh on it, but honestly, this just didn't hold my interest. It's a fun relic from a different time. It has some funny bits, but I just didn't really think there was a lot here for me to dig into. 1.5 out of 5. Yeah, so that's it. That's the first year. That's the first Academy Awards and their first ever Best Picture winners in their competition. In sum, I would say this group of movies had a pretty even distribution of highs, lows, and middles. I don't really consider the Best Picture category to be indicative at all of what is actually the best movie in a year, and I'm not really knowledgeable of film history enough to know what else came out around this time that really holds up these days. But I can say I'm glad that I knocked Sunrise off of my should-watch list, and I'm glad I found something I really, really, truly liked in The Crowd. Wings was cool to see, and the others, well, I will say they all had moments that impressed me. Every one of those movies has something special, even if I didn't like them overall. Here is my personal ranking for what I watched, and if you have any comments or anything, I'll take them. I think this is a part of the video where you say the standard YouTube spiel, but I'm not really going for that. So I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought, and maybe I'll be back and maybe I won't. I've never done this before, and maybe I'll never do it again. Who knows? This has been me watching some movies.
1.4 to play, out of timeouts. Garrett Temple reads for him, didn't get him, and gives Shai Gilgeous-Alexander credit as Devontae sends it. Gets it!